If you're wanting to use force plates either in a rehab or performance-based setting, you have to understand how to read a force time curve. The force time curve is the graph that tracks the forces being put into the plates, and if you don't understand how to interpret the graph, you're gonna get lost. In this video, I'm gonna take you step by step on how to understand the basics of a counter movement jump, which is the most common jump that you'll do on force plates, and how it presents on the force time curve so you understand how to interpret it. Let's dive in. So a force time curve is a running graph that tracks the forces being put down into the plate over time. So as things are running longer and longer, your time continues to go on, and as the forces are being put through the plate across that sheet, you'll have, again, forces that are going up and down and time that continues to run. So after you finish your assessment process, you'll have this really long graph because time has gone on, and then you'll have instances where you have your assessments performed and you'll be able to see some really common patterns. So this is an example of a force time curve representing a counter movement jump, which is one of the most common jumps you'll use with the force plates. So the first phase is simply the standing phase. So you can see here, the line is completely flat. The individual that's standing on the force plates is just standing there and not moving. So there shouldn't be any fluctuations in the forces being put into the plates, which is why the line is flat. So the second phase is the unweighting phase. So when someone's performing any type of counter movement jump, there's a short period of time when they're initiating the movement where they're actually in a moment of free fall. So you'll see that there's actually a decrease in the amount of force being put down into the plates because you're off-weighting your legs, and there's this very brief moment where your body is free falling and you actually are putting less pressure into the plates than when you're standing, which is why the graph drops down. After that brief moment of the unweighting phase, we then transition into the eccentric phase. This starts as soon as the unweighting phase finishes. So again, we have that brief moment of free fall, and then the eccentric phase, as the graph starts picking back up here, is when your body is starting to put force down into the plates. And you'll see that the graph continues to pick up and up and up, because as you're going into the eccentric phase, you'll actually start applying force into the plates that's greater than what you were just standing at naturally. So there you'll see as the curve rises that it rises much higher than just what your standing weight is. And then as we get to the top here, you'll see that there's a peak, and that's where the next transition starts, which is then the concentric phase. So I've always thought that the concentric phase is interesting because as you transition from dropping down into the eccentric phase and you're starting to explode upwards, to me, intuitively, I always thought that during the concentric phase, I'm applying progressively more and more pressure down into the floor to propel myself upward. But as you'll see here, as you finish the eccentric phase, that during the concentric phase, there's actually a drop in force being put down into the plates, which is why we have a drop off here. And the reasoning for that is as you're propelling yourself upward, your body's starting to rise and lift off of the plates, which means less force and less pressure down into the floor or into the plates, which means a decrease in force that's being put down into the floor. As you get to the end of the concentric phase, you'll see that there's a spot where the graph ends and flatlines. That is where we transition into our next phase. So as I'm sure you can imagine after talking about these previous phases, that when you're in the air, there's obviously no force being put down into the plates. So that's why you have this flat line where the graph bottoms out. It's because you're in the air, there's no weight being put into the plate, so it's reading as 0. So the entire time that you are in the air and the graph is flatlined, that is what's called the flight phase. And our final phase is called the landing phase. So as soon as you come down to land and your feet begin to make contact again with the plates, you'll see that there's a spike again in force that's being put down into the plates. Therefore, we have a spike on the graph. And then as you again settle again, the graph will then level off. And essentially we return back to the standing phase. So those are the basics that you need to get yourself going with using force plates and understanding a force time curve. If you've got any questions on the topics covered in this video, drop a comment below. I respond to everything. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video.